you said you were initially a teacher in the early 2000s. I believe you said you left the profession in 2006.
Yes, that's right. 1996 to 2006. Yeah.
And you mentioned it was because you started to see then. So again, people in my age bracket, 2006, we would have been in, primary school, would have been very, very young children. I believe I would have been in how old would I have been? I was maybe like year 3, maybe year 2 or year 3. I'm not sure if anybody happens to be listening to this out in the States. I know there's a very, very small listener base out in the States. I'm not sure what that would equate to with like kindergarten and grades and stuff like that. But very, very young children. We're talking about 6 years old was when I would have been around then. And you said you'd already noticed then that there was almost like this political infiltration into the school system, and so that it wasn't becoming just about educating children. And I noticed this as I went into got a little bit older as well, that seemingly this indoctrination through the school system started to set in even as early as you were noticing it around the turn of the second millennium, and just when you left up until 2006. What were the things that you were seeing at that time that sort of got your senses tingling, so to speak, that this actually maybe isn't good?
Well, actually, I hadn't seen it then, but I think a lot of it started soon after I left, especially with there's talk now about the over-medicalisation of children, and so I know that I think the year that I left, or possibly the year after I left, that was when they started bringing in the flu mist for all the infants and giving them all the flu vaccine. But yeah, to come back to that, before I left, there were initiatives such as healthy schools and eco schools. So the eco schools initiative was obviously the forerunner for, indoctrinating children about the environment. I'm all for teaching children about nature, yes, and I do feel that we have probably got a nature emergency on our hands, but not so much the climate emergency. I think that's come on a lot in more recent years. When I came back, there had been a 10-year gap, and I could see there was obviously more things coming in then about climate change and the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, with children being taught their rights, and I feel that rights need to be taught in conjunction with responsibilities, but there didn't seem to be so much focus on children learning their responsibilities. And of course, now in recent months, it's coming out now that schools are facing a crisis of behaviour, behavioural issues.
And this eco schools initiative was sort of like the preliminary, like the foundations, I suppose, for what we're seeing now with all of the net zero indoctrination and quote unquote education into those things, where kids are growing up now scared that the sun monster is going to devour them in the next 10 or 20 years, whatever it is. Because that was what it was like when we were in school. Everything had to be green. We were going to run out of fossil fuels. Like the planet was warming to it's going to basically burn all of us alive, and we're going to go through all these resources in the next 50 years. So we got to be carbon neutral or whatever it is by 2030. They were laying it on thick back then when I was in school, and it only got worse when I saw them looking back on it now. Didn't see it at the time, obviously. Bringing in things like cashless system, which was like the preliminary for digital ID and those kinds of things. So when you came back to the profession as a supply teacher, then how much with regards to these initiatives had you seen them progress? Like, were you massively shocked by how far you'd seen them progress, or was it kind of like, based on what you sort of started to see before, it was sort of like, oh, I'm not really surprised by this?
Yes, the latter, really. I wouldn't say I was massively shocked, but, another 5 years has gone since I left, so it probably has escalated since then. But Yeah, I was more shocked by the way, I don't know, the whole school ethos had changed in 10 years. I was warned by a colleague that was obviously still in the profession that behaviour had gone really bad, and that, you know, children had, my colleague had parents coming to her asking for advice on parenting, you know, which it shouldn't really be happening. There's enough information out there really for parents, but I think parents are just getting so confused these days with, you know, in the last few years, we had the abolition of the reasonable chastisement defence, you know, when you're, or the smacking ban. Yeah, the behaviour had really deteriorated. And also there was a big emphasis on safeguarding, which, you know, that had really sort of escalated. But ironically, when I came back to teaching, I thought I was going to be able to go out and, as I previously did when I first qualified, you know, I thought I could go out and register with the local authority, do some supply work. You get paid when you register with the local authority, you get paid at your scale rate, and then you can, you know, maybe work in a few different schools that you can become regular schools, so that you get to know the schools, the schools get to know you, the children get to know you. But when I came back, I was told, no, it's all changed now. You can't approach individual schools. You must register with an agency. And so I then thought, right, I'll look into this. And I'd already put my CV online, and I had a phone call quite quickly from an agency. In the meantime, I'd found out that the Education Workforce Council, which is a sort of governing body for all teachers and teaching assistants in Wales, you have to be registered with them. They had brought out this thing called the return to teaching, so that if you've been out of teaching for 10 years, you have to do this return to teaching. But essentially, it was just a box ticking exercise, because I had to choose a school. So I went back to my old school, and I said, can I do this return to teaching with you? And it was basically a case of planning and delivering a few lessons, being observed, and then, you know, filling in a form, sending it off to the Education Workforce Council. So I was in the process of doing this. And of course, this agency approached me and, oh yeah, we can give you work tomorrow. And I said, well, no, you can't give me work tomorrow because I have to do this return to teaching thing. And they didn't even know anything about it, you know. And I don't think they cared. If I'd turned around and said, yeah, that's fine, where do you want me? They'd have sent me. Anyway, I sent my return to teaching forms back, and then I asked the EWC, the Education Workforce Council. I said, right, so what's the procedure now? You know, when can I teach? And they said, well, you know, pretty much straight away. So I suspect that these forms aren't really looked at. I suspect that they don't even check with the school. You know, it's all nonsense, like a lot of things in the teaching profession, unfortunately. But anyway, so I did that. I went back and worked in a few different counties as a supply teacher. But there were a few things that I well, first of all, I joined forces with some other supply teachers because it was shocking, really, that the poor remuneration that we would get being paid through an agency. They would take up to 40% commission for starters. And of course, in return for that, schools are not getting value for money because they're not getting teachers. They don't care. The agencies don't care about, what's the word? Having the same teacher in the same, I can't think of the word.
Consistency?
Consistent. Yeah, there's another word, but it escapes me. But, you know, they just want somebody. For example, I was in a school one week. I think I was there on the Thursday, and I got talking to the children first thing in the morning. Oh, yeah, you're the fourth teacher we've had this week. Continuity is the word.
Continuity, yeah.
Yeah. So the agencies don't care about continuity. they don't care even if you're suited to a particular, they tried to send me once to an autistic unit. Now, although I'd worked in a school which had a speech and language unit attached to it, where many of the children were autistic or, on the spectrum, and they integrated, I had experience of them, but I wasn't confident enough to go and work in an autistic unit, because I feel, you do need special training. But the agency didn't care. They would have sent me there if I'd agreed. So there were things like that. There was, lack of continuity, lack of not caring about who they send where. I found out as well that some schools, particularly, I think this is more in secondary schools, are not sending qualified teachers. They're getting people who are employed as cover supervisors. So a cover supervisor is essentially a babysitter. So if your child is in comp and their teacher's away and they've left work for them, then these cover supervisors come in and they just essentially babysit. It's just dumbing the whole teaching profession down. And of course, the safeguarding. I picked up on a safeguarding breach actually 4 years after I'd been on supply. Just before I left in 2020, my agency had told me that they'd received an email from the Disclosure and Barring Service, the DBS, the people who they sort of check to see if you've got a criminal record or whatever. Mm-hmm. So they said they'd received an email from the DBS service to say that they didn't need to see my DBS certificate. Now, at this certificate, I carried with me, because the agency do tell you in your email you're supposed to carry your DBS with you when you go to any school, but nobody had ever asked to see it. But so they had ticked a box apparently to say that they'd seen the hard copy of my DBS. And the one thing with this, I've got it written down here because in case I forget, it's possible. On the DBS, there's a section of the certificate which is titled Other Information. So if that's the important part to look at, because it's theoretically possible if an agency hasn't actually had sight of the hard copy of your DBS, theoretically it was possible for anybody working in the education system via an agency to have information in that section which would normally exclude them from being employed. So that was quite a serious breach. And I funny enough, since speaking to you last week, I wanted to refresh my memory about things. So I went back and I found this in an email. I'd communicated with the Wales Audit Office on this to let them know what had happened. And they then said they would advise Estyn of the issue, which Estyn is the, the school inspectorate in Wales. So presumably hopefully that's changed now, but they were made aware of it just before I finished in 2020. So there's a lot of shenanigans going on. These agencies are, I've heard stories of head teachers being taken to the hospitality boxes in the Principality Stadium, because they want to get their agency, they want to get as much work obviously as possible for their agency. So yeah.
Grease in the right palms by the sounds.
Yes.
Grease in the right palms. And that's the thing that you mentioned there, with everything you mentioned there, obviously there would be a lot to summarize there. A lot of great insight for if people are parents and want an insight into what's really going on behind the scenes of the system, at least when you were in there, whatever it may be like now. I would imagine it's only getting worse. And the biggest thing that you mentioned that I wanted to go back to what you mentioned really early on is that all of these now initiatives have been brought in, whether it's, I don't want to, rag too hard on like safeguarding issues. Obviously, safeguarding is very, very important. But all of these initiatives, like extracurricular political initiatives, have been brought in, and the quality of the education itself, children seem to only be getting worse from what I've seen, at least in terms of their behaviour and in terms of their output in a lot of instances. and you mentioned that there was like this disconnect, or that these parents were going to the teachers and asking them for parental advice. Do you think that, obviously in today's society, and it's obviously reflected through the school system as well, where it's now deemed an offence to cause offence in some ways, and now there is this complete lack of any kind of discipline, or in some instances even adherence to any kind of objective reality in some instances, that treating everything with kid gloves as to try and not offend people, whether they're adults, whether they're children or whatever, losing that discipline and losing that kind of enforcement and understanding that your actions, your words, they're going to have real negative consequences you're going to feel in these instances. And that if parents try to do that, you mentioned the smacking ban, for example, parents do so much as, you know, accidentally walk past their kid the wrong way now, and the kid can go and tell the school, seemingly, and now the parents got to wonder if they're going to be held on a witch trial, kind of. Do you think that some of the parents are scared by some of the things that they may face if they were to try and, you know, enact some kind of discipline, do you think?
Definitely, yes. Yeah. You know, I mean, they don't know, you know, children do go to their teachers. They do come out with things in class sometimes, which you think, oh, and yeah, it's one of the first articles I had published on TCW was about the smacking ban. And in the course of speaking to some academics who had come out in protest against banning smacking, you know, there was something mentioned about health professionals were warned as well that if they were, they could lose their jobs if they were seen to be, or, you know, I think if they got found guilty of any, you know, misdemeanor like smacking your child or whatever, they could possibly their jobs were at threat. And yeah, I just think that there's just so much confusion, and you can see, I think over the year, I think a lot of parents, even before it became law not to smack your child in Wales, the message was, it was being transmitted that, you know, I think people thought it was illegal a long time before it was actually illegal, you know. But it's also sending out a message about chastising your child in general. I think, you know, parents are probably too afraid of going overboard with any form of discipline, you know, in case, as I say, it gets repeated in school possibly, or, you know, and it's beginning to show. As I said, I got bitten by a 4-year-old when I went back as a supply teacher. I regularly saw children having meltdowns, you know, infant children. This was, I never saw that before at all. And I just feel so sorry for the children.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And again, you guys have no real recourse either. You think back to schools, and I'm not saying that in a way that it was necessarily better the way that it was done maybe in the Victorian times and stuff like that, where, you know, you had the cane and things like this. Not necessarily saying things that were better then, but I think in many instances, certainly kids growing up without that discipline and without knowing that actions are going to have consequences. And again, obviously adults can go overboard with these kinds of things, obviously. I just think kids growing up without that line, without knowing where that line is, and without that line being able to be enforced, because I said, you know, the government, from what I've seen, at least from examples out in like the States and Canada, and I think in some instances here as well, they seem to want to find any little reason to take kids away from parents. And then often those kids end up with really bad outcomes. Examples of kids being basically forced and coerced to undergo the sex reassignment surgeries after being basically kidnapped from their parents. I believe there was an incident that happened in, I believe it was California, and there was another instance of it happening in Canada as well. But I believe that happened because the mother was trying to push the child through it. Do you see any ways to, like, any potential obvious solutions or anything like that of how these problems can begin to be like rectified? What things would need to be put in place to maybe try and improve the outcomes of kids and improve their behavior, and in general then make things better for everyone? Because obviously these kids are going to go out into the world. They're going to be your next doctors. They're going to be your next prime ministers, potentially first ministers, you know, members of the Senate or members of Parliament, or whoever it is. You think we have a vested interest in making sure that they're going to be very, as at least as well adjusted as possible?
Yes, and I think a lot of these, you know, there's a lot of mental health. There's been an escalation in mental health deterioration, really, you know, and I think that, what was I going to say? Oh, sorry, I'm losing my track.
Yeah, no problem at all. Take your time.
Children need boundaries. You know, it's that's the number one rule of parenting, really. You know, you've got to have boundaries. And as I said, they were being taught their rights and not their responsibilities. And, you know, it was getting to a place where you couldn't, you had to be careful about what you said about a child, even in a report. You know, they've got to deal with, they've got to be able to take the rough with the smooth. They've got to be able to take on board criticism, take on board discipline. And yeah, you know, they're now, like I said, they're now beginning, the Welsh Government now beginning to realise that there is a big problem. You know, even another thing which I'd noticed in the intervening period after being away for 10 years was that some schools, whereas before you'd have certain schools with certain units like speech and language units, autistic units, there were even EBD units, which is emotional and behavioural difficulties. So there were children being put into units with these issues. And, you know, it shouldn't have got to this situation. And I don't really know what the answer is. You know, I think people are beginning to realise that screen time is not helping children as well. I mean, I was in one school where there was a child on the carpet falling asleep, and he sort of crawled under a table, and I was told by the teaching assistant, oh yeah, just leave him because he's awake all night on his brother's iPad. And you know, but yeah, you know, and when you see the recent initiative where they're offering I think £5,000 bursary to encourage students of colour to come into the teaching profession, I personally feel that there are so many children, sadly, that are lacking, who may not have a father living with them, or they're lacking a positive male role model in their lives. I personally feel that it would be far more beneficial to try to encourage more men into the profession, especially at infant level, because the children do really respond well to male teachers. You know, it's such a female-dominated profession. And, you know, they love having a male teacher, especially these children who don't have a dad, like I said, at home. And maybe that might help. That might help. I'm not saying women can't discipline or can't discipline as well. But, you know, I just feel that might be something to consider, that the Welsh Government should consider, really.
Yeah, I think that goes back to like, again, not to go into a more broader conversation about this. It's a massive conversation in and of itself. Like in my opinion, irreplaceable role, or the irreplaceability of each parent in the household. You know, at least the way that I see it is that there's certain things that not only it's like a father's duty to do, but there's things that only he can do via virtue of like, you know, if you want to call it position or whatever it is. And there's certain things that only mothers can do. So again, I know you can get in trouble for saying those kinds of things nowadays, but again, it's like where you're saying there, it's like, having that person that, as you said, for the kids especially that are growing up without dads, either for some tragic reason like they've passed away, or you know, they decided to walk away, and that child, especially for young men, they haven't got that person to show them what a man is, to show them how to be and how to act. And you know, it's at least difficult to make the case of how they would learn that without that person being there showing them. So I think it's a great point that you make there. And one last point on this, did you call them EBD units? Emotional and
Emotional and
behavioral
difficulties, I think it stands for. Yeah.
What sort of things would fit into there that they had a separate unit for this? I understand, like in my comprehensive school, for example, they had a unit, and it was for kids. I believe it would have probably fit into these kinds of things as well. Kids that had to be taken away from just regular kids because they kept getting into fights due to the an inability to regulate emotions for whatever reason, all of these things. Is that the kind of things that would be fitting into here, is it? Yes. And how it would differentiate it from the other types of units?
Yes, I think so, basically. Yeah, and one of the, I've made a few notes here in case I forget about things, but, there was, another thing I noticed coming back after 10 years was that there was a lot of, there'd been an explosion in children on the autistic spectrum as well. And a huge increase in the number of teaching assistants. And so the whole school environment could get quite chaotic. I was in some classrooms where you'd have lessons constantly interrupted by teaching assistants coming in to take children out for interventions, one-to-one interventions. So maybe they needed to catch up on maths or English, but another thing that was mentioned was ELSA, emotional literacy support assistance that children would have. So certain children, if they weren't severe enough to go into one of these units, they would still be taken out of class occasionally for these ELSA sessions, which, I don't know too much about, but obviously it's concerning that there are so many children with these emotional issues where, like you say, they can't regulate themselves, can't regulate their behavior.
Do you think, again, you say don't know much about them in the context of everything else, do you think that, again, they're having like a broadly positive impact, or would you say that there's not really enough information available to sort of say whether they're having a positive, negative, or really no impact whatsoever, these additional sessions, and how they're being administered based on what you've been privy to?
I couldn't really answer that, I'll be honest, because I didn't see I haven't really looked into that enough, and I didn't, it was just something I happened to notice. And I thought, well, we never used to have that. We never used to have children having so many sort of meltdowns and tantrums.
It just seemed as when there was, again, a strong, almost like a strong relationship or strong understanding between the school and the family. And ever since that really has broken down, and again, it almost is like the school is, I don't want to say trying to take kids away, but is almost trying to, in many instances, again, drive wedges between the kid and the family, between the relationship between the family and the school. At many instances, you have schools now at odds with parents that, either voice concerns about some of the things that their children are being taught, or new initiatives that are being brought in. Ever since it's like either the public schools have, under guidance from the Welsh government or whatever it is, forgotten or taken on this different role where now it just seems everything is at odds with the family. It just seems as soon as that has happened, that everything has gone downhill. Children are more confused than they ever have before. Their behaviour is worse. More often than not, the educational outcomes are worse. And I just hit on a day. I think that was going to be one of the biggest things that's going to be needed for improving the school system. Absolutely.